anger about whose dish was being served, whether it was hers or her mother's, about that being about who gets the right to feed in analysis, whether it's sort of her meaning or her analyst's meaning, and the kind of fury one has at a correct interpretation because it's correct and because it's coming from someone who isn't oneself. You know, that whole psychodynamic of the transference and meaning and feeding. And I was wondering, in your experience as an analyst, is there an observable difference in the temporal qualities of the transference when you're being used as a maternal object or when you're being used as a paternal object? Is it that the feminine, maternal transference is more about space and taking people's place, or is it, I mean, I would imagine that perhaps the paternal did refer to time in a different way, in a way that the maternal is often about space and place.
I think that depends very much on the individual, really, because people's experiences of a mother or a father can be very, very different, and people may have had fathers who've taken up huge amounts of space and been very imposing, or have been very far away, and similarly with maternal transferences too. So I would be very hesitant in generalising or assuming that any set of behaviours belongs to a particular gender, whether consciously or unconsciously. So what I'd be really attending to is what's very specific for that person, consciously and unconsciously. I mean, it may be in certain cultures, certain associations with gender predominating, which of course is true and may emerge, but as an analyst what I'm really concerned with is what is that specific experience for that person.
In your extremely wide-ranging paper, and of course you can't say everything, but all the same, I miss Bion.
All right. Mm-hmm.
Because after all, his ideas about time, he is a psychoanalyst.
Yes.
And his ideas about time were quite idiosyncratic to himself, I think. For example, he argued that we can remember things that happened ages ago just as clearly as remember things that happened yesterday or today.
Mm-hmm.
There's no difference there. Secondly, I remember him saying arguing about the dream, that although we remember the dream in narrative form as one thing happens another, we recount it in that form, but he suggests that at one moment the whole dream is there, and the next moment nothing is there, and the next moment the dream is there in its entirety.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And he also, in his rather controversial things he did in the States, he also wrote a book called A Memoir of the Future, in which this past, present, future seems totally ignored.
Right. Mm.
And I was just surprised that you didn't bring it in, as you seem to bring in Heidegger and everybody else, you see.
For some reason, I've read very little of Bion, and I'm not sure why. And he's my next person I really want to read. I was very taken with his saying you should approach sessions about memory, because I think that enables one to be, very fresh and alive to the experiences at that moment in this particular telling of the particular narrative of a patient, without imposing something that where there might have been a considerable shift. But I certainly would like to read more of Bion. Somebody else has said that to me before, so that's my next project.
Could I suggest, maybe I'm just pre-associating again, but the audience in the last paper, Sabadini's paper, felt free to have opinions and to express them, including me, because we were watching a film, which was a sort of fiction, as it were, created by a great artist. But when it comes to dealing with case histories and people and whatnot, we all become inhibited, because we think there's something called facts, which prevent us talking about them with the same freedom. But whether psychoanalytical theories are any more factual than fictions and constructions, I'm not very sure.
That's a very important point, exactly. Yes, I mean,
if you're in Africa or somewhere else, somebody may fall, a young girl falls ill, and she's told she's inhabited, possessed by the spirit of her dead mother. But if you're going to a Kleinian analyst, you're possessed by an internal object, which is your mother internally, whatnot. Well, except for some little difference in the metaphor used, it's difficult to, from my point of view, they more or less can be equated. So, and I don't think, though, also, that this idea that somehow in psychoanalysis we're dealing with facts should inhibit us, because it's often said by analysts that a theory is true because it works. Somebody brings out a new theory, they try it out in their patients. If they find it useful, they continue to use it, and thus the truth of the theory is established. But possibly the most efficacious of all theories in the world is spirit possession. Through spirit possession, many more people have been cured than by psychoanalysis. But none of us would agree with at least none of us, some in general, but most of us would not agree with the theory on which the cures of spirit possession, the girl recovers, are based. So the fact that a theory works doesn't mean it's true. And of course, unfortunately, anyway, these are, of course, I'm a heretic anthropologist, as you see, so I always have different views.
Well, I really welcome the view of an anthropologist, because I think it's critically important that we don't assume interpretations are universal facts, and that as analysts we're very sensitive to all of the possible metaphors and meanings, and that these can shift, and it's very evident when we're working with people from different cultures that, you know, there can be many possible meanings, and we can't also know the experience of that person. And I suppose with the case study there, what I was emphasising was our very different temporalities and you know, the problem of otherness for this particular patient. But I certainly, you know, Merleau-Ponty's emphasis on cultural context, I think, is, you know, very much, you know, has similarities to much of what anthropologists have been talking about for a long time.
Well, it's true I've raised the cultural context, but one doesn't have to go abroad to find differences in interpretation. One finds plenty of differences among analysts themselves, all of whom, each of the school analysis claims to have a monopoly of the truth. And that's just the way things have a religious quality.
Well, every person we work with is different. I mean,
yes,
it's from a different culture in the sense that they're from a different background, history. It's more obvious with
But when you said, towards the end of your paper, that you had difficulty in understanding this thing in Freud because it didn't seem to be consistent with that thing in Freud, should we be looking for consistency? I mean, if you take Lacan's method, I haven't been reading a bit of Lacan recently. If you take Lacan's method, Lacan has a problem. Something he doesn't quite understand. He feels is not quite understood in the field world of psychoanalysis. His method is always to return to it. He's always circling around it. And each time he returns to it, he understands it differently. Now, it's not as though he refines the previous interpretation. They're all just there, and they certainly aren't always completely consistent with one another.
I mean, that's what I respect in Freud, is that he's always returning and questioning, and he's often acknowledging his contradictions.
Yes.
And I think that's terribly important in terms of developing any theorising, that there isn't a kind of linear path.
There was, yes, please.
Yes, I was going to ask you about internal migration, because it's easy to use the Hoffman, for example, the cross-cultural thing, but is there a way in which you can think about internal migration into different aspects of ourselves, for example, into language? You know, why is it, or what's the function of migrating into a certain aspect of ourselves and our expression or embodiment, or however you want to think of it?
Do you mean in terms of the strangeness of encountering aspects of ourselves or our experience that we might not have expected. Yes, I mean, I think that's very connected to why people are so terrified of changing. And in a sense, that shift is about articulating or finding another language, and a language which may be completely new. And I think, go on.
I was thinking about the old young man you bought, and how he particularly sort of, perhaps migrated, not right, sort of projected himself to certain aspects of behaviour and presentation and experience.
I think that's very relevant, because I think for him the future was like a completely terrifying alien land. It was partly filled with the fear of being dominated and controlled, and in that sense aspects of his past were being transferred onto his notions of the future. But also the complete unknownness of the future was very, very terrifying. So terrifying that's, I think, was very related to his thoughts of violence, that he desperately needed to be in control.
Perhaps I'd be allowed a quotation from Bion again.
Yes, please.
Who remarked to me, I was one of his patients, you are afraid that as a result of analysis, you will end up being the sort of person you've spent your whole life trying to avoid.
Right.
Yes.
Is that the same as Jung's shadow? It's a similarity.
In a way, yes. But
well, I could, to come back to Freud, there's that quotation, interpretation of dreams. Dreams predict the future, but a future that is a perfect likeness of the past. As well, that could come in here. About that sense of being the stuckness and impossibility of leaving that past behind, that struggle.
Yes.
That struggle that needs to be. That struggle even staying in the moment, as an analyst with the patient.
But I think
very respecting that kind of space that's almost outside of time.
But I think what's very important in that is to be also aware of where a possibility is opening for the future, and not to assume as that the past is just being repeated and that has to be analysed. And I think it's, the possibilities of creativity, of feeling differently, of feeling more alive, all of those are just as terrifying as the more sort of shadow side of experiences.
I'm encouraged here as well to be a little bit inconsistent. As you were talking about this patient that had to suss out her mother's moods, yeah?
Yes.
It came to me Sartre, bad faith, yeah?
Right.
That came to me, or Gestalt, phony.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
I was hoping that you'll say more about that.
Do you mean in terms of the question of how much she could risk being authentic, that she took the cues from her mother in relation to kind of form herself?
Also, how did you find difficulty being with her when she did not allow herself to be authentic? And was it conscious or unconscious?
Yes. Which patient were you talking about? Because I think that's an aspect of both. Jane, who cancelled the session, and the other one whose mother's breasts were right.
I think it was Jane.
Yes, that's right. Yes. It's quite difficult answering some of these sort of questions because these are composite examples, so have these shifting images. But in that, with that person, I think what would be critical is being very attuned to, like that really, moments of risk, moments of which she may be unconscious, like in dreams, which is why I wondered if you meant the last example too. Paying attention to the creativity of the dish that she had made, and yes, resisting really being drawn into a sort of confirmation in which, through that changing, the person might also be attempting to please me. I can think of somebody I worked with who I thought, you know, gosh, she seems to be more interesting and alive, and at the same time I felt there was an element, a quite subtle element, of that's what she imagined that I wanted as the therapist. So it is delicate.
Yes, please.
I think one of the reasons it's perhaps difficult to for the audience to talk too much about this is because we don't know everything that goes on. With clinical examples, it's very difficult to know exactly what goes on and how you dealt with these things. For example, I'd like to know how you dealt with your patient's complaint that you changed the room, for example, or changed something in the room. So there's sort of, you know these things, but it's quite difficult to sort of understand the whole picture because you've given us a sort of snippet, obviously. I mean, that case was particularly interesting because of the sort of threat in the analysis. So, I mean, could you say something?
Yes.
I mean, what does it mean to you that he's complained about this, and what did you say to him?
Well, what was interesting about that person is that I was very challenged in that way, and I think in a way your question is perhaps picking up on that, because it felt like that I might tread into a landmine at any minute, and his sense of himself was shifting constantly. The key thing that was very present most of the time was an absolute terror of being out of control, so that anything I said could have the possibility of him feeling absolutely terrified and possibly violent. And so if I would make a transference interpretation in relation to, you know, how the room had been changed at all, and it would be minute things, you know, if I had a vase of flowers, he would find that very, very threatening. It felt humiliating. Sometimes he didn't have really a sense of himself as being a subject in the way in which I could really talk about a you and an I at that moment. So it was very difficult, very challenging. I was very struck when I said to him that he was trapped in the present, that he did have a visible sense of relief and said that, and seemed quite amazed because this really touched him. So I think out of all the people I've worked with, that person has probably challenged me the most.
I suppose I wondered what I might have said is something like, when I do this kind of thing, perhaps you perceive me or experience me as like your mother who lets you down. Because that is a reality, isn't it? That you really did change the room. That's not his, it's not a fantasy. You know, when you really do things like that, with anybody, I mean, you know, when you cancel appointments or come late or whatever, that is a reality in the analysis. And I think that particularly with sensitive patients, to make a transference interpretation might be quite provocative. It's just...
Absolutely. I mean, I think all of one's responses, it depends on the particular relationship at a particular moment, at a particular time with a particular patient. So that...
Well, that's why I've sort of hesitated, because I think, you know, one can't be there from moment to moment. But I think that sometimes when one actually, in the here and now, does something which is like what's really happened in the past, then I think it is inflaming in a way to make a transference interpretation as if it belongs to the patient, whereas it doesn't really. It's just a thought.
No, you're absolutely right, exactly, and you know that's certainly something I experienced with the person. I mean, that person is also made up of some other people, but there's a dominant picture I have in my mind of a patient.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Splendid paper.
Thank
Greatly
you.
enjoyed it.